All these catastrophes left the agency, and particularly Caesarea, its spearhead, bruised and confused. Amit set up a number of inquiry panels to try and analyze what had gone wrong. The predominant figure conducting these inquiries was Michael Mike Harari. When their work was completed, Amit named Harari the deputy head of Caesarea. Harari served in this position for 5 years, first under Yosef Yariv and then under Zvai Aharoni. But in practice, he was the living spirit of the division and, in effect, commanded it. In 1970, he was made head of Caesarea, a position he held for 10 years. The 15 years during which he led the division were the most important and turbulent in its history. Harari was nicknamed Caesar and became the figure the most profound intelligence in the world of Mossad's special operations. Harari was born in Tel Aviv in 1927. Two events shaped my life, he said. In 1936, while still a child, he witnessed the violent riots by Palestine's Arabs against the Jews and the British, which later became known as the Palestinian Revolt. I saw the rioting mob and a burned-out British jeep with the charred body of the sergeant still gripping the steering wheel. When he saw the Arabs and Jews fighting, he says he did not hold back, but went into a nearby store and chose what looked like the best weapon, a hefty pick handle, and went to join in the battle against the Arabs. The second defining experience occurred in 1942 when he went down to play in the streets and arrived on a scene only a few minutes after officers of the British police's CID had shot dead Avraham Stern, the commander of the extremist Jewish underground group Lehi. I saw them bringing down the body. And then I went upstairs. I was a boy, and no one stopped me. I went into the apartment and saw the closet he had hidden in. These things affect you. In 1943, he lied about his age to join the Palmach, the secret army of the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine. It was underground. It was a secret. It intrigued me. He took part in many actions, including the sabotage of rail lines and bridges, attacks on British police stations, and intelligence collecting. He was arrested several times by the CID. After World War II, when the Haganah command learned that Harari spoke a few languages, he was sent to Europe to help with the transportation of the surviving Jewish refugees to Israel. He was involved in the secret acquisition of ships and the complicated logistics involved in moving these illegal immigrants through the ruins of Europe on the boats, then smuggled them into Palestine under the noses of the British. That was the period during which I created for myself the criteria and the methods for covert activities abroad, the tools that I used later on in the Mossad. After the establishment of the state, Isser Harel recruited Harari to the Shin Bet and then the Mossad, where he rose rapidly before being assigned to investigate Caesarea's operations. What he found was a unit in very bad shape with a hodgepodge of personnel, former members of 188 Mifrats and the Birds, the operational unit of Shin Bet, among others, a fuzzy combat doctrine, and undefined goals. That's a mess. Caesarea's string of failures led Harari to the conclusion that Caesarea must be rebuilt from the bottom up, with its objectives, tasks, and personnel redefined. After several months of work, he submitted his doctrine to the heads of the Mossad. In my view of the world, I believe that any country that wants to live must have a Caesarea of its own, a clandestine, compartmentalized, and elite body that will be able to carry out beyond the country's borders the things that no other agency in the country is able to do. It's a unique tool for our leadership. It's a unique tool our leadership can use to operate against the country's enemies. Harari set Caesarea's primary objectives as targeted killings, sabotage, collecting intel in hostile target countries, and special ops like smuggling abductees across borders. Most of the Mifrat's field operatives that Harari investigated were former members of the extremist anti-British underground group who'd been recruited by Isser Harel and commanded by Yitzhak Shamir. Harari found them to be extremely tough, with a lot of experience in combat and covert ops, ready to pull the trigger when the moment came. In other ways, however, Harari found them to be very weak. They always failed in the getaway stage. I ordered that in planning an operation, the same weight be given on the goal and the getaway, and if there's no way of getting out in one piece, don't execute. Harari ordered the establishment of a targets committee, which would make in-depth studies to decide who'd be on the hit list, and ruled that slaying should never be carried out in close contact with knives or other cold weapons. The field personnel in the two operational divisions, Caesarea and Colossus, disliked being called operatives, which sounded bland and perfunctory, lacking the appropriate heroic inflection. Worse was agent, an almost derisive term reserved for foreign nationals who'd been recruited to betray their own countries on Israel's behalf. Rather, they considered themselves warriors, lohamim, dedicated to defending and preserving their young nation. Warriors, though they both might have been, there was an essential difference between the personnel of the two divisions. A Colossus spy arrested in a base country, one with full diplomatic relations to Israel, like France or Italy, might risk imprisonment. In a target country like Syria or Egypt, a Caesarea warrior would likely be subjected to a horrific torture and interrogation and then executed. The exposure and capture of a Caesarea operative is perceived as a national disaster in Israel. This is why Harari insisted on iron discipline and zero errors. And indeed, from the time Harari rebuilt Caesarea, very few significant errors have occurred. In the entire history of the division, Eli Cohen is the only operative to have been caught and executed. This phenomenal record, says Ethan, who was a top officer of the unit for many years, was achieved mainly thanks to Harari's innovations and, above all, waterproof cover stories. The recruitment process was also a key factor in their success. The main weapon of a Caesarea operative is the ability to work deep undercover. Ethan explained, "This weapon has to be built in. All the rest, we cannot teach them. All the rest, we can teach them." I'm gonna say all that again because that was fucking weird. The recruitment process was also a key factor in their success. The main weapon of a Caesarea operative is the ability to work under deep cover, Ethan explained. This weapon has to be built in. All the rest, we can teach them. The Mossad was given access to Israel's population database, which Caesarea's selection experts scoured for certain types of people. For Harari, the natural place to look first for his personnel was among those serving, or those who'd formerly served in combat roles in the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF. But this was just the start of the screening process. After the downfall of Eli Cohen and the exposure of Mossad's use of Jews from Arab countries as spies, he decided to rely mainly upon people who could pose as Gentiles from Western countries. The perfect candidate was of European appearance, one who could pass as a tourist or businessman from a country whose citizens were welcomed in the Arab world. One pool of recruits consisted of the children of Israeli scholars or members of the Israeli diplomatic corps who had spent considerable time overseas because of their parents' jobs. But most of Caesarea's recruits were immigrants who had lived in their native countries until adulthood. In very rare cases, Caesarea would recruit a Jew still living outside Israel, because they had offered an obvious advantage. They did not need to be trained to play the role of a non-Israeli. On the other hand, former training chief Giffer explained, there was a corresponding complication with such recruits. All aspirants undergo a thorough security check by Shin Bet, of course, but if an immigrant has not been properly distilled by Israeli society, if he or she hasn't served in the IDF, hasn't developed a network of long-term friends, doesn't have relatives in the country, it's much more difficult to ascertain their loyalty to both Israel and the Mossad. It's even possible that they're already spies for another country. Consequently, the background checks following the initial polygraph test for Caesarea recruits, already the most stringent in the Mossad, were made even tougher, with the investigators sometimes traveling abroad to scrutinize a candidate's past. A massive effort was invested in the recruitment of each candidate. Once prospects were identified, they received calls from persons who identified themselves as government employees and suggested a meeting in a cafe, where they were described in very general manner what it was all about. Others received a somewhat cryptic letter from the Prime Minister's office or the Defense Ministry with more or less the following language: "We offer you a chance to take part in an operation involving varied and unique activities which will confront you with exciting challenges and give you an opportunity to contend with them while reaching your full potential and personal satisfaction." In addition to this direct approach, the Mossad has long run ambiguous want ads in Israeli newspaper referring to a state organization seeking candidates for challenging work. This is probably how Antifa recruits. From those pools of potential recruits, the Mossad began winnowing down the group through a variety of tests until they were left with only those psychologically fit for the job. The screening process for all operational jobs in Mossad was, and still is, conducted by Mossad recruitment officers and psychologists. Harari insisted that the psychologists themselves undergo an exhausting training program, including the horrific prisoner exercise, so they would realize what qualities were demanded from an operative and be better able to screen the candidates. Finding candidate operatives with all the desired characteristics was and is a very difficult challenge. In the Mossad, they note with pride that their acceptance rate is 0.1%. Moti Kiffer put it this way: "The desired warrior has to be a Zionist. He needs to identify with Israel and its objectives. Above all, he has to have a balance of contrary characteristics. He needs initiative without being aggressive, brave but not fearless, outgoing but reticent. They must be willing to take huge risks, but without putting..." Man, that's one of those tilt rotors. These things are loud. Fucking Brits. "He needs initiative without being aggressive, brave but not fearless, outgoing but reticent. They must be willing to take huge risks, but without putting the mission and the organization in jeopardy and without this turning into a death wish. They need to be able to live a life of lies and deception while transmitting reliable reports and not hiding anything from their commanders. They need to employ personal charm without creating personal connections. They need sociopaths." And then there's, I added that last part. And then there's always the question of motivation. Why would a man or woman want one of the most dangerous jobs in the world? There are two groups of warriors, Kafir says. One comes from, oh man, that plane messed me up. One comes from the positive direction, people who are coming to something. Second group comes from the negative direction, people who are getting away from something. The ones from positive directions don't have a problem making a living, and they don't have wives who don't understand them. They are people who come to serve Zionism and seek to satisfy their spirit of adventure. They want to see the world, to play because they like the game. The ones from negative direction, they're people who are running away from something, who don't like their homes, who haven't been successful in a civilian career. They are people who are trying to create a better life for themselves.